Well, we do have longer now. Is this on? Oh, there we go. Marvellous. I've had the nod from behind the curtain. We're ready to go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today. I'm Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this event in partnership with the Centre for Progressive Policy, Investing in Britain, Creating a Framework to Unlock Growth. And the essay question for this panel is essentially, given the very active policies that are being pursued by China, the United States, the EU and other parts of the world, how can the United Kingdom use devolution, tax policy and other incentives to try and create an environment that will strengthen British growth and ideally distribute it more evenly around the country and avoid the over-concentration of wealth and power in London and the South East. Joining me to discuss this is Charlotte Aldrich, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Progressive Policy, Margot James, former Conservative MP and Digital Minister who's now at the University of Warwick, and Nick Timothy, columnist, author and former Downing Street Chief of Staff. Now, if any of you have been to a Con Home event before, you will be familiar with the format. For those of you just joining us, thank you. We will have short introductory remarks, then we will have a mediated discussion up here for a bit, and then I'll throw the questions out to you. So without further ado, since we're running a little bit behind, over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you. And thank you to Con Home for hosting us, the CPP, here at Conservative Party Conference. This is obviously a fascinating conference, probably what will be a year almost potentially to the day before a general election. And really it seems that the Tory party is battling with its ideological identity. And the topic of today's conversation, I think, really gets to a pivotal question that sits behind many of those ideological tensions and debates. What is the role of the state in growing the economy? And I hear that Liz Truss's events have been doing very well, and she certainly believes that the role of the state should be minimal in thinking about how to grow the economy. At CPP, we take a different view. We don't think that the benefits of growth trickle down from the wealth creators. But on the other hand, we also believe that redistribution via tax and welfare can only take us so far. Instead, we think we need a model that unlocks the productivity potential of all people and all places, and this model we call inclusive growth. How do we think we achieve that? Well, through the 3 Ps: place, the importance of devolution, as Henry mentioned, the relationship between the local and national, both in terms of our economics, but also in terms of our governance structures, and the importance of tackling those inequalities that we know are endemic, both within and between our places. Number 2, productivity. Here's where we think about effective industrial strategy, and yes, we do think we need one. And the role of the private sector and the levels of investment that we think business needs to put into our economy to create high-quality jobs and for UK PLC to thrive as a result. And then finally, public services. And here we support the idea that we need a healthy workforce, we need affordable childcare to make work and having a family compatible, skills and training, public transport, and all of that combined, we think, should go together to creating more productive individuals and communities, and therefore a more thriving national economy as a result. Rishi, as he looks forward to the next election, rightly and understandably, is thinking about how he wants to respond to the challenges of today, and particularly those questions and issues that are at the forefront of the electorate's mind. But in many respects, I think he would do better to look back to some of the strategies of the party's relative recent past, including his own plan for growth. In 2021, he published what I think was an excellent paper setting out 3 things that would be at the heart of driving the economy out of the then kind of post-pandemic phase. And I think, unfortunately, with the just seconds ago announcements free HS2, it seems like we're backtracking on what was a very good, robust plan for growth. So number 1, infrastructure. Number 2, skills. And number 3, innovation. Layer on levelling up and layer on thinking about net zero and a plan for kind of capitalising on Britain's place and evolving place in the world. I think you had the bones there for thinking about the answer to this question of how we grow the economy. Add, and I'm sure Nick will talk about this a bit more, some of the things we saw during Theresa May's time on industrial strategy, particularly the focus, for example, on grand challenges and the idea of place and the need to link place with industrial strategy and sectors approach. I think you there have the recipe for how you create strong and robust inclusive growth that starts to unpick some of those productivity problems that have hampered the UK for such a long time. I think unless you do that kind of hard graft of making the economy work more effectively, I think a lot of it kind of falls down to sort of empty promises, really. So I won't get into the weeds of HS2, but infrastructure, skills, innovation, industrial strategy, I think those are the things that we need to be looking at if we want to really create an inclusive economy that works for everyone, because without that, we're going to be stuck bouncing along the bottom of this kind of productivity problem, and we won't have the growth we need to get the country motoring again. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should just say, since I forgot to do it at the beginning, to extend the apologies of Andy Street, who was going to be joining us and unfortunately is no longer able to do so. Margot, over
Thank
to you.
Well, first of all, I can't believe that I'm on a panel in Manchester talking about investment and growth, and the reason why the Mayor of West Midlands, seemingly to me, isn't here is because he's dealing with the fallout of an announcement that we've made in Manchester to cancel the northern half of HS2. But here we are. Anyway, my journey has, over the last few years, has been quite an eye-opener, really, because I was, as Harry said, a business minister, and then following that, digital minister, up until 2019. And since which time I've been at Warwick University, and I've seen, like, from the other end of the telescope, if you like, how investment policy is driven and the impact at a local and regional level it either has or doesn't have. So it has been a very interesting journey, and it's made me more a believer in devolution than I ever was. As a business minister, I supported very much Greg Clark's work in developing the industrial strategy, and I still think that, as Charlotte said, that a strategy that evolves with time and has input from all over the country is the right way forward. Notwithstanding that, I think that to a certain extent, certainly since Rishi and Jeremy Hunt became Prime Minister and Chancellor, there has been a more coherent approach to attracting investment, and the 5 areas, sectors of the economy that Jeremy Hunt outlined earlier in the year as being Britain's growth potential sectors and what we needed to do to support them, I think is very much along the right track. Because, of course, in terms of devolution, every region has its own needs. I mean, definitely in Coventry in the West Midlands, the automotive sector is a hugely important employer and innovator. If you're up in the northeast, then the same can be said of renewables and chemicals, and elsewhere, different priorities. So it's essential, I think, that devolution is used as a means of attracting investment and building up ecosystems, supporting ecosystems around the country. So just as an example of what we've been doing to encourage investment in the automotive sector since I've been at Warwick, and very much supporting Andy Street, actually, who asked me to chair a task force for the West Midlands on electrification and how the region prepares to support the transition to electric transportation. And as Charlotte says, it's all about infrastructure, skills, supply chains, access to sustainable sources of energy, and planning reform, in my opinion, as well, and the opinion of many others I know. And so our task force set first to grips with the planning system, and with very good support from Coventry City Council and Warwickshire District Council, we were able to get planning permission for Coventry Airport to have a gigafactory put on its site. And we're not there yet, we need to find an investor, but that brings me on to another aspect of what I think the government has done well, which is identify parts of the country for investment zone status, and the West Midlands is an investment zone, and there are good, clever rules about the investment zones. Although it's a whole region, the actual tax advantages can only be deployed in 2 parts of the region, which means it doesn't get dissipated and fragmented, which is the danger of too much devolution. So that around the Gigafactory site, I think will attract the required investment. On the back of the fantastic announcement by Tata Motors earlier in the summer, where they have finally committed to build their batteries in the UK, which is a huge boost to the new batterification sector. Skills and supply chains are another very important part of attracting investors. A company making these decisions are obviously, as I'm sure we all know in this room, they're global corporations for the most part, and they've got competing bids, from Asia, America, Europe, and the UK, amongst others. So you have to really have a good case, and skills and supply chains are important. So that was the other thing that the task force that I chair tackled, to make sure that we get the right skills in place that the industry needs, and that is a challenge because in the new battery sector, most of the skilled jobs require level 2 to level 5 skills. Universities don't teach at that level by and large. Even degree apprenticeships are level 6 and above. So you need a vibrant FE sector, and the FE sector, despite all the efforts of governments, is still on a bit of a shoestring compared to universities financially, and they can only afford to put on courses for jobs that are right here, staring us in the face right now. They can't invest for the future, and that's where universities should support them, and that's what we've been doing. Finally, also on a positive note, the innovation accelerators that George Freeman announced last year, again, 3 different parts of the country, and it's getting the mix of incentives, for financial incentives. We've got to compete with the new US IRA Act. That's very, very difficult, and Europe's response. So the tax incentives are very important, but it's the wraparound. What can we do with planning, energy, skills, supply chains that really put the icing on the cake for investors, whether they're domestic or foreign?
Thank you, Margaret. And it's always lovely to have somebody else mention the words planning reform before I need to find an excuse to shoehorn it into the conversation, which I would have done. Nick.
Thanks. I will also mention planning reform, so Henry can be very pleased with today's efforts. In the intro, Henry listed various things I do, but I'm also now the party's prospective candidate in West Suffolk. And one of the very many interesting things about life in West Suffolk is that the constituency runs just to the east of Cambridge. And there's lots of disparate, differing interests in the constituency. But the one thing that you can see unites those interests as a kind of single theme is that basically the next quarter of a century in West Suffolk is going to be defined by the economic geography of Cambridge. And why is that? A government of every hue, I think, would want to try to take advantage of the opportunities that are in Cambridge. We don't have very many obvious prospective high growth zones, but that is one of them. And there are clues to what we might do in the future in the experience in Cambridge already. Things like strength of institutions like the university, but also the ways in which industry has kind of clustered around Cambridge. That's not just life sciences, which is an obvious example, but tech too. And governments are going to have to try to build on those things through strategies. And the main thing I want to say at the beginning is we're having a slightly odd debate in the party at the moment where different factions are saying growth is good, as though that was news. And I feel a bit conflicted about this because, first of all, actually you shouldn't really get any political points for saying that growth is good when you don't have growth. You have less to invest in your public services and your public spaces. You have lower prosperity for everyone. You have greater demands on the taxpayer to compensate for the fact that there is less for everyone. It leaves us less equipped to deal with the fact that we have things like an ageing population. But actually, it does need saying that growth is good, because there are some people in politics who, for one reason or another, think that actually we may be entering into an age of degrowth, and that may not be a bad thing, that quite often they're motivated by environmentalism. But actually, in a lower key way, I think the Treasury is afflicted by this mentality. And I should be careful and not talk too much about the Treasury, because I may go on forever, because it's a very problematic institution. But if you talk to lots of officials in the Treasury, they quite often will say, oh, well, you can't really expect especially high levels of growth in a country like Britain, because we're at a late stage of development for a mature economy like ours. To which the obvious answer is, well, why is it that on a per capita basis, Americans are approaching 50% richer than we are? Why is it that in Europe, a bigger country than we are, like Germany, is richer than we are, and a small country like Switzerland is richer than we are? Clearly, there is lots of scope for us to catch up. And actually, quite often, by catching up, it's not actually even about the sort of whizzy, new, innovative technologies of the future and that kind of thing. It's actually about doing what we do already better, and doing things like maximising domestic supply chains. And on a related point, the Treasury also quite often says, well, when there are global shocks, well, of course Britain's more exposed to this because we're a services-dominated economy. But normally they say that that's a sign of advancement and maturity and sophistication and success, which is somewhat contradictory. But I think my personal view is that one of the fundamental problems is that our economy is insufficiently balanced. So I agree with Liz on this narrow point, and I think it is the case that our economic model that we've had for my whole lifetime, which in its earlier stages was established for pretty good reasons. Think about the problems of the 1970s and what Margaret Thatcher did to bring the country back from the brink. That was successful in those stages, but we face different challenges today, and the model has led us to a point where we have long-term issues like poor productivity, low investment in skills, low investment in tech. We have very few robots. I think the joke is in lots of countries that the robots are coming to take our jobs. In Britain, the robots worry that the humans are coming to take their jobs. We have these sort of long-standing problems and the regional imbalance in our economy and so on, that is now meeting quite pressing new immediate concerns, whether that's about the changing balance of power in the world caused by the rise of China and Asia more generally, and what that means to global stability, whether it is about changing technology and the pressures that that's going to bring to bear on lots of existing industries, whether it's about things like competition for scarce resources and the cost of energy and so on. So we're at a particular pressure point, I think, where those old challenges and new challenges are coming together. My answer to that, very similar to some of the things that have already been discussed, but actually I think from a conservative perspective, there's actually something in it for everyone. Because I think the only answer now is that we have to go big in the way that we think about economic policy, and its need to change, and we need to go full spectrum. So by that I mean there's some things that actually the Tory party is instinctively very comfortable with. Doesn't mean it's still easy to do, but we're more comfortable with it in terms of things like deregulation. We've had this conversation recently about the nutrient neutrality rules that are stopping the construction of up to 100,000 houses. That's a good example of regulatory reform that needs to change. Maybe we'll get into high speed 2 later, but the infrastructure that we do build is unnecessarily expensive and takes ages to build. Our Crossrail cost £19 billion. It took 23 years to do it. This is nuts, absolutely nuts. And the comparison with equivalent infrastructure in various European countries puts us in a very poor light. Sizewell C, fortunately is in East Suffolk, not West Suffolk, That had an environmental statement of 44,000 pages. I recommend you follow Britain Remade. They're a very good organisation who are highlighting some of these problems. 44,000 pages, and still the people who oppose Sizewell C won court application to pursue a judicial review on the basis that the environmental impact hadn't been sufficiently considered. These are the reasons why we do not build enough. So in some ways, I think the state needs to get out of the way, but in other ways, the state needs to play its proper role in the economy. Now, in some ways, this is actually about getting macroeconomic policy and big reform programs right. So I think monetary policy has been a big problem over the last 15 years. We need to try to get a better balance between monetary and fiscal policy, and there are ways in which fiscal policy might need to change in our attitude, certainly while we can't obviously have deficit-funded tax cuts and that kind of thing, what we can do is have a more open mind about the way in which we might borrow to fund things where we know that they will create a valuable asset or that they will have a return on investment. Our pensions rules are crazy. It's another hangover of the Gordon Brown era where all risk had to be eliminated and therefore all growth was eliminated. So we need to get British pension savings invested again in British equities. But then I think we have to do some things that probably felt quite quaint for a while and were sort of marginalised in the way that we thought about a lot of economic policy. Our trade deficit is a huge problem, not only in its own terms, not only in the fact that it signifies that we're not making, doing or selling enough of what the world needs, which lots of clever people will say that doesn't matter so much, but lots of people with ordinary common sense will understand why that might be a problem. It obviously causes these kind of perverse outcomes where, in order to make up for that deficit and the current account deficit, we end up trying to sell off everything that isn't nailed down. That's not just British-owned businesses. Increasingly, it's property, it's land, it's things like that, which contribute to asset bubbles and unaffordability for people who live here. I think industrial strategy, as you've discussed already, is hugely important. This doesn't mean picking winners. It doesn't mean corporatism. It means trying to take a strategic approach to the ways in which we make investments in things like energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, skills. The big problem with the economy actually is a lack of investment, both private and public, I think. And we need to, and a big part of industrial strategy is also to maximise what we can do with supply chains in the industries that we're already reasonably good at. And we need to be realistic as well about the way the world works. Britain, this goes back to the 19th century, but Britain has a slightly strange unilateralist, purist view of things like free trade. International free trade has never existed. It's certainly not going to exist in a world in which China dominates. So we need to work out what it is we do in response to subsidies and ways of getting around global trading policies, whether that's China or whether it's actually, I was going to say friends, I'm not sure any country is truly a friend, and I'm not sure America actually is, but friendlier countries than China, like America and various European countries. So to me, it's go big, it's go full spectrum. Some of that's easy for Conservatives to hear, some of it I think is more challenging, but I think when you step outside your ideological box, you sometimes get better policy.
Thank you very much. I think I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to restrict my section to only one or two, but I'm the chair, so I'm going to take one or two. I think the first one, and I'll go sort of up the panel, because I think we'll start with Nick, because you've written about this concept of civic capitalism, which I'm quite interested in. Industrial strategy does have a bad rap. The word industrial strategy has a bad rap in conservative circles. But if you think about so much policy, most Conservatives think that we should be running, right? Railways, for example. No one seems to believe that we should allow private railways to just be springing up across the country anymore. Energy infrastructure, schools, housing, we'll say housing, and all of that. And once you've nationalised or got massive government investment in those areas, you're kind of doing a sort of semi-industrial strategy anyway, even if it's by neglect, because decisions you don't make or do make will affect how the country develops. So I suppose my question to you is, if you're trying to sell industrial strategy to a Conservative audience that might be instinctively sceptical, what areas do you think the government could play a more active role, and how do you avoid falling into the trap which you often fall into when politicians are dispersing money and power, which is you do end up with the kind of picking winners trap? How do you avoid that?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is, Margaret Thatcher did industrial strategy.
Okay.
Well, I think some people think that the legend means that she didn't. But I mean, if you think about things like the Nissan investment and the revival of the British automotive sector, if you think about things like the redevelopment of the London Docklands, these are all examples of the kind of things we're talking about. And in fact, I think in reality, the choice is not do you have an industrial strategy or do you not have an industrial strategy. It's more, do you have one and admit it, or do you kind of stumble into it and do it in a slightly less strategic way than you should? Because in reality, actually governments do pursue these policies, as you say. Britain effectively has an industrial strategy for financial services. There's a DG in the Treasury with responsibility for financial services. Funnily enough, there isn't one for any other sector of the economy, which tells its own story. But lots of investment decisions are made on the basis of whether they work for Canary Wharf in the city. Tax and reg changes are made only with quite a lot of caution about the city. The Brexit negotiations, they were very mindful of the importance of the city in those talks. We do it for that sector. We're not quite so careful to do it for even sectors that actually we should be incredibly mindful of, like life sciences, for example. So I accept that it's actually a terrible name, and we should probably come up with something better. We should reassure people that this doesn't mean ending up picking winners in terms of specific companies. I think one of the ways in which you can do that is through institutional frameworks. So certain decisions should be made by ministers, and they should be politically accountable for them. Certain decisions should be made slightly further away, so there's less of that political temptation to intervene in that kind of way.
Okay, so maybe we could call it Great British Industrial Strategy. That's
even better.
The government strategy. Charlotte, how would you, if you were, because industrials, how would you sell industrial strategy, and what specific things could the government do that it's not doing now that it would make a sort of the maximum bang for their buck in terms of trying to stimulate economic growth, especially given the importance of levelling up in the light of this announcement in parts of the country that don't get the love and attention that London and the financial services sector get?
Yeah, well, I really like Nick's point about if you've either not either have an industrial strategy or don't, but just admit and make it a strategic one, and that one that meshes with your wider economic policy. And I think at the moment I'm a bit confused as to what the government's position on that is. So I think having clarity, and I think another can of worms to open up is the net zero rollback, at least on the timetable, and the signal that puts to business and investors as to the direction of travel for the country. I think, in a way, not to get into net zero itself, but the fact is, if you are setting out a vision, I think one of the core fundamentals needs to be that you're kind of broadly committed to it, and you're committed to it within the period of the same government. I think backing business, promoting investment, and that's what an industrial strategy is designed to do. And I think those are core values of the Conservative Party, so it shouldn't in any way be incompatible. I think where governments have tried to overstep their role and remit when it lends itself to picking winners, I think, unfortunately, that has tainted a kind of wider approach, and it need not do necessarily. And I think we can point to not only our examples here, but say something like the decision of Angela Merkel's government to kind of come out of nuclear, for example. I mean, there are examples where governments have done this very badly, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be, as I said, backing business, having a clear vision about where we want to get to as a country, are aligning the support that we put in via HE, FE, R&D subsidy, or any of these other facets of our economic policy to make Britain an attractive proposition for investors.
Perfect. The German nuclear decision just remains one of the most absolutely abysmal policy decisions. And this country makes loads of them, but Germany actually beat us to having maybe the single worst. Margaret?
Well, I don't think that Conservative governments have always eschewed the idea of industrial strategy, because it's only sort of 5 or 6 years ago where when the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, it was renamed thus by Theresa May, and I served in it as a junior minister. And a lot of focus at that point was developing the industrial strategy. And it most certainly wasn't about picking winners. And I think as a country, we've got to get over this fear of picking winners. I mean, it hasn't been really a policy since I was a child, practically, which is regrettably a long time ago. So I don't think there's any danger of that. But what happened after that industrial strategy was launched was that it was summarily chucked overboard by a subsequent Conservative Secretary of State, in spite of the name still being on the door. And so what we ended up with for a period of time was a continuing set of government interventions, but without the underpinning of a strategy, which seems to me to be the worst of all worlds. For example, I mean, it was at that point that the government intervened in the automotive sector to state that there would be the regulations would prohibit the sale of new internal combustion engine powered vehicles, after the year 2030. That was an intervention in the market. And it caused a lot of consternation at the time, but it also did drive investment, because at least companies had a clear vision of the way in which Britain was travelling. And it turned out to be quite helpful, so helpful actually that the disappointing retreat from that, announced a couple of weeks ago, and the postponement of it to 2035, isn't, I don't think, going to make that much difference, because almost all the large automotive companies are all geared up to the 2030 rule anyway. So it was kind of a safe ball, I suppose, for the government to play with. Although I think it does, unfortunately, underline the government's growing reputation for stop-start, lack of coherence, abandoning certainty, what with the HS2 announcement, and other sustainable energy reversals. I think that is contributing to the sort of uncertainty that we were trying to get rid of after Brexit. So I do feel that is a retrograde step, and I very much agree with what's been said already about how the government needs to set a fairly long-term certain sense of direction for the key industries that are going to be our growth stars of the future. And without that, I think that we will continue to see the disappointing investment levels that Nick referred to, both public and private, in this country relative to our international peers.
Thank you. Charlotte, you want to come in?
Oh, just a really small point, that I think if business and industry are sticking to the original timetable anyway, I think that just highlights the weakness of government's approach rather than a strength.
Quite agree.
Okay, right, we've come to the Q&A at last. So, given that we are conscious of the time, I'm going to give my usual spiel. Please, a couple of sentences and a question mark will serve you just fine. We have some excellent panelists. They probably know the context. If they don't know the context, you are frankly asking the wrong panel or the wrong question. So, we're going to take, how many microphones do we have? Is it one or two? We have one. Okay, well, we're still going to take two at a time so we can try and get through some more. So we're going to take the gentleman there in the third row, and then the gentleman there in the first row. Thank you, and then we'll come back. Right.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself if you
My name's Neil Salt, here representing one of the London areas in Lambeth. A question for the panel, given the news that we've all just heard Charlotte first mention, that HS2 isn't now going to Manchester as well. What is it about our country that seems to have costings 4 major infrastructure projects that way exceed expectations or formulations that are made from the outset. We hear that many other countries are able to create the infrastructure that similar to ours at a much lower cost. What are we doing wrong that other countries are doing right?
Perfect, thank you. And front row there.
Hello, Alex Morton from the Institute for Economic Affairs, although obviously it's my own question, etc. I agreed quite a lot with Nick Timothy, which might scare him. But the point about business versus consumers is critical in that a pro-business and pro-consumer policy are quite different. Nick's point about the rentier economy is very good. Part of the reason that we are that rentier economy is because we don't have planning reform, we don't have good energy policy, we don't have other things. So the only way you can get people to come to Britain is by going, we'll let you rip off consumers. And to get around that requires government reform. To have a pro-consumer policy requires a complete overhaul of Whitehall. Do you agree or disagree, or do you think that's a kind of distraction from the Centre for Economic Mission?
Question mark got in there just in time. Thank you very much. We'll just go down the panel. So, Nick, would you like to start?
I very much admired the way Alex said it's from the IEA and said it was his own question, so that they're libertarians even even when it comes to that. I mean, I'm not sure it's always quite as binary as pro-consumer or pro-producer, but I completely agree with what you said about our our economic model has now basically come to Britain so you can rip people off. I mean, one of the things that I think is the case about the regulated utilities, it's not the problem of privatisation. Private ownership is not the problem. The system of regulation is the problem. We started off with nationalised industries that were terrible at investing. We privatised them. They took advantage of their market freedoms. They increased the investment. The ownership model was reasonably local and kind of connected to the places that were served. And in the end, they were all bought out by private equity. And what does private equity do? They cut investment, cut wages, increase dividends, and bugger off. That's basically what's been happening. And I think from a regulatory perspective, should we tolerate that at the point at which these firms buy in? And second, I think we have a big problem with systematically over-rewarding investors because we're afraid that the flow of investment might not continue, and the victims in that are consumers and the wider public, given the various stories we see about the quality of our waterways and so on. On HS2, I just, what's the Irish thing about I wouldn't start from here? I remember when the party in opposition was trying to work out its policy on the third runway on Heathrow Airport. Obviously, it needs to be built. Obviously, it still hasn't been built as a case in point of what we're talking about. I can see some shakes of the head. We need aviation capacity in this country. And in some ways, the HS2 policy was actually a political fix rather than a serious policy solution to what the country needed, because, frankly, the party decided that it was going to oppose the third runway for electoral purposes, and promising HS2 was going to be part of the solution because the idea was that it was going to transfer lots of flight traffic to high-speed rail for domestic travel, which I don't think was ever really a plausible thing, but it kind of worked as a line to take for a while. But lines to take don't translate into clever policy, in my experience. The bigger question, rather than the rights and wrongs of HS2 itself, is why are we so bad at doing these things?
That was
And I think so I referred earlier to Britain Remade. I think it's well worth reading their stuff. I think we've quietly re-regulated the economy, in particular for reasons of environmental protection over the last decade or two now. So we need to do something about over-regulation and poor regulation. We also need to do something about the culture of consultation and the culture of judicial review. I'm not saying that communities shouldn't be consulted, and I'm sure I'll be calling for a lot more consultation in my constituency in the future. But obviously there's a way of doing that doesn't actually prevent you getting things done, and we've got that quite badly wrong, I think. The third thing is we ask a lot of communities to take the pain of infrastructure projects and none of the benefit, and we've got to try to work out how people can directly benefit from the things that they might not choose in an ideal world, but for one reason or another need to come to a community like theirs, whether that's housing or energy infrastructure or railways or roads or whatever.
One thing I've read about this, one thing I'd add to it is that you could stop MPs adding 3,000 requirements to HS2 in the legislative stage, and stop requiring HS2 to try and give you a number for how much it will cost before the MPs have done it, because that number is going to be nonsense. Charlotte?
I'll keep my remarks pretty brief on this. I think there was a snippet in The Spectator actually that's pointed to a study that was done that showed that across the board the UK major projects were kind of between 7 and 15% more expensive than comparable international examples of things like compulsory land purchase, planning, and then the delivery itself. So that's just worth a quick look. I think the other thing, just reflecting my own experience working in Cabinet Office, at the time the Major Projects Authority was there to fix this kind of problem. I think, and Cabinet Office suffers from the same sorts of problems that Treasury does from a slightly different angle. But I think one of the things that we've been pushing for at Centre for Progressive Policy is to make sure that you aren't just relying upon a small group of civil servants in Whitehall to help navigate what is a highly political, in fact, almost entirely political decision-making processes that A, take far too long and then are prone to flip-flop and all the rest of it. I think you need a different style of leadership that integrates regional and local leadership in the planning, design and delivery of national scale projects, particularly on infrastructure. So an example might be having mayors sitting on the National Infrastructure Commission. They are to a point, and Andy Street is one of those, but I think that relationship needs to be much deeper.
Okay. Margot?
Right, why are we so bad at infrastructure projects, big infrastructure projects? I think it comes down to a number of factors. Procurement, the accepting of original budgets, as if everything's going to go swimmingly well from the moment that you commit to the original budget. I think we're very bad at that. Far too lax political leadership and project leadership, very poor project leadership, but political leadership, we, through the sort of mid, 2012 to 2018 period, far too many giveaways to particularly Conservative constituencies in the Chilterns area, and it's added hugely to the cost. All the tunnelling, which was not part of the original plan. So if you haven't got political strength to resist Conservative ministers who are threatening to resign, when you've got a working majority, as the coalition did, that you're on a hiding to nothing. And the costs are inevitably going to rise, as is, of course, the lengthy delays as well. Our whole planning system, and Nick mentions the point about consultations and how they go on and on and on, that breeds costly delays. Of course, delays equals rising cost as well. And lack of leadership. To get something like HS2 to deliver on time and anything like on budget, you would have needed somebody like Lord Young of Graffham or Andy Street to have it as his or her full-time occupation for 10 years. And it would have been in a much, much better place. But we never had that at all. So other countries do it better. I think other countries, some of the countries in Europe are much bigger. And when you're looking at high-speed rail, you could go back to the original decision and challenge whether this country, given the size it is, ever really needed high-speed rail. But having committed to it, I think, reduces this to a laughing stock, the decision today, I'm afraid. Just a quick point on your question over ripping off consumers. I mean, that may well be the case in some sectors, but certainly in energy, if you look at wholesale energy prices across Europe, Britain is pretty much in the middle. But when you look at what business actually has to pay for energy, it's vastly greater than many other European countries. And that is because we load the costs onto business of all our sustainable and renewable energy policies. They're all loaded onto business. I mean, you have a choice as a government. You can load them onto consumers, business, or the taxpayer. I mean, that's the three choices you've got, and you can do a hybrid model if you like. But there's far too much loading it onto business, which is making them uncompetitive versus other European countries. And energy is a huge, important part of attracting investment. You've got to have access to renewable energy, and indeed, that's another thing. Why have we got a national grid system where it takes you sort of 5 or 6 years to get a connection? I mean, that's shocking. And it doesn't matter whether you're Tata or, a small business, it's the same, although happily, I think the government's got to deal with Tata. That won't be the case down in Somerset, but there's so much that needs to be done. I sound like we're in opposition, don't I?
It's a common theme I'm finding. Right, I like Icarus, I'm going to try and do one last round of questions. This could go horrible. I'm going to beg for absolute brevity. So we're going to have Fred, and we're going to have the gentleman over there, just so I can divvy it up between the sides of the room.
Thank you very much. I'm Fred de Fossard from the Legatum Institute. In 2007, the United Kingdom had pretty much the same GDP per capita as the USA, and the pound was worth $2. In the intervening period, as Nick said, the GDP per capita of the United States is some 60% quicker than ours. What's America got right, and what has Britain and also Europe got wrong?
Okay, and if we could just get the microphone over there as quickly as possible, and this will be combined with sort of closing remarks, just so that we can...
My name is Rupert Lewis from the Royal Society, but a former official working on industrial strategies of various flavours. They came and went in a fairly short space of time, and it's quite hard to front that up to industrial stakeholders. And it went because one or two people changed jobs. That was it. There was no big grand plan. It was just a few individuals switched. What needs to change in political parties, and it sort of touches on Charlotte's leadership point, for good policies to transcend the rotations of people, for a new minister to pick up the baton and be proud to do it.
Okay, perfect. Right, thank you. And we're going to go down the panel, and this will be closing remarks as well, but I think we've managed to get 2 rounds of questions instead. Okay.
Hello, Rupert. Thank you for that very difficult question. I think on the politicians, I mean, when I go back to the key change of personality was the removal of Theresa May by Boris Johnson and his supporters in Parliament. And I would say, looking back at my colleagues at that time, there were some people who were genuinely great supporters of Boris Johnson and thought he'd be very good. There were people like myself on the other side who were very reverse. In the middle, there were people who thought that Boris Johnson they were getting very worried about an election, as they are now, and they thought that Boris, albeit they knew that he wasn't fit for office, of high office, they thought he'd save their seats. And I think you need politicians who are going to have more backbone and more sense of public duty than to put their own seats ahead of the national interest. It's a big ask, because this is not new, of course, it's not new at all. But I think it's become more so in recent years, and hopefully with the nomination of people like Nick, that is going some way to restore that sense of sort of public spirit, which has been sadly lacking of late. So hopefully that is, that's the answer. I mean, it's not an easy answer, but I think that really is the answer. More stability, that's what we need. I mean, churn has been dreadful. It really has.
Thank you. Charlotte?
I didn't answer your question. Do you want me to?
I think we're...
Yeah.
We
Okay, yeah,
absolutely.
fine. I've answered one, that's
We're pressed
enough,
for time,
okay.
yeah. But we
Sorry
can,
about
between
that.
the three
Fine.
of us, we can
Right.
handle it, I'm sure. Charlotte?
Well, I was just going to build on your point, Margot, by saying if you look to the US, I mean, they're potentially between Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and then Joe Biden. I mean, and that's like the definition of instability and change and churn. But as Fred said, you know, despite that, their economy has continued to kind of pull ahead. And I think that's partly because of the kind of myth surrounding the purity of America and its Anglo-Saxon model. And coming back to industrial strategy, the US is willing to invest, but it also has the resource to do so on a scale that we don't. And I think just to make a point about labour strategy, for example, I think Bidenomics is predicated on having that capacity, and we don't have that. So I think trying to replicate that kind of intervention is not what we should be trying to do. Having said that, I think if we look to answer the gentleman's points over there, one thing that I would certainly criticise of Rishi's statements in recent days is the introduction of this new towns fund, for example, and adding another kind of funding pot to what is already a highly fragmented local government finance landscape. And if you're thinking about how to make long-term policy that sticks, for example, what you don't do is just keep establishing these small funds that effectively do exactly what the last fund was meant to do. Yeah, and it doesn't give places nor government the ability to deliver or even set a strategy that then they can put that resource behind to deliver, and we end up in this kind of short-termist, ineffectual cycle merry-go-round.
Lovely. And Nick, you've got about 90 seconds to stick the landing.
Fred, innovation, investment, affordable energy. Industrial strategy, I think, it's lots of things, but institutions.
There we go. We actually pulled it off. We managed to end on time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Please join me in offering a round of applause to our panel.
Thank you very much, Harry.
Thank you again to the Centre for Progressive Policy for sponsoring this event. I hope you found the debate informative. I certainly did. And I'm sure I'll be gazing out at you from some of the Conservative home events tomorrow. Please do check out the rest of our roster. Thank you very much.
Your voice is speeding up.